Welcome everybody to Monday Night Live. I'm Derek Arden, and today I've got Curt Vincent from Philadelphia, the USA, with us. And Curt's a cybersecurity expert. I'm going to read out his introduction because it is so impressive. A cybersecurity entrepreneur, founder and leader of Morgan Stanley's 400-person cybersecurity division for 15 years. Curt has served as Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for the Operations Command Center at Bank of America and Vice President of Development Operations Team at Goldman Sachs. Curt is also a retired US Army Lieutenant Colonel. I had to ask him what that meant, and I'm sure he will explain it. It's pretty important. Who was recalled to active duty by name following 9/11 to be the Operations Officer of the Army's Global Worldwide Network and Security Operations Center. An adjunct professor at Mercy College, who has 5 company startups under his belt. Curt, welcome to Monday Night Live. Absolute privilege to have you join us. And perhaps you can tell us how you got into this. I think you left school at 17 and suddenly found yourself in the Army.
Yeah, that's 100% true. First of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. This is a great group of people. And having watched others of your shows, it's a very intelligent group. So I'm going to have to stay on top of my game. How I got into this was not by plan. The story goes that I was a bit of a rebellious teenager, and my father forced me to quit high school and join the Army on my 17th birthday, which actually turned out to be the very best thing that ever happened to me, because I ended up in an environment wherever I did anything right, I got pat on the back and told, keep doing it. So just to be able to fast forward, I ended up putting in 7 years in the Army, got as a helicopter mechanic and a co-pilot, got out, went to engineering school and graduate school, and then went back in as a very old 30-year-old second lieutenant and started my career off again, and still was able to retire a lieutenant colonel, which as I was explaining when we were talking one time with Derek, that's 5 steps up from second lieutenant and 2 steps from general, but it's 2 huge steps from general. And so I'm just very happy to have made that. Now, the one thing I wanted to be able to answer when you said, how did I get into this? I stumbled into it. I didn't expect to get into it. And it's part of a story that would take a lot longer. And if you have any kind of experience with cybersecurity at all, it was not something that was by design. And by this, I mean, I've been involved in the internet since the internet began using the current set of protocols that we're using today from the mid-'80s. And what happened then is everybody was responsible for their own security. There was no sort of organization that would outlook. So the thing is that I continued to grow as a network engineer and began to be involved in the expansion of the internet and the civilianization, if that's a word, of the internet. And when I got into Morgan Stanley in 1997, the CTO called me in his office and he said, you know, I think this internet thing's going to be big. And while we laugh at that now, he was very, very sincere, saying he thinks it was going to be big. And he says, I want you to start a cybersecurity group at the time, which we called information security. And so I went into it as a technologist. But the thing I really love to be able to explain to folks, and I hope we talk a little bit about it, one of the things I've learned in being a cybersecurity guy is that it's about the 360 view. And the big thing that is missing, and I feel is going to be the next and the final step within cybersecurity, is actually looking at people. And that's something we should talk about. So I hope that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. It's quite scary what you did. But then, so you were in the army. So were you in the Army and then you went to Morgan Stanley and then you got called back because of the Iraq War?
Exactly right. Yes, I was in the Army and I had been part of the Army Computer Engineering Center. And then I was also with Special Forces with Desert Storm and was deployed with Special Forces. Now, I want to make it real clear. I was an augmentee. I was not one of the snake eaters, if you will. So I was just there in support as a technologist with mostly the intelligence systems. So because of this deployment and with my understanding of how the networks all tied in I was called back for both the role as the operations officer for the network operations, which included satellites, as well as the security aspects. And at some point, we actually need to be able to discuss the difference between civilian cybersecurity and military cybersecurity, because there's one big distinction that's different. So I'll let you ask me later.
I'm going to ask you now.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. In the civilian sector, the name of the game is to keep bad people out at all times. And I don't care how they get in. And most people only think about cybersecurity from the standpoint of the networking, because you see this in movies and TV. I like to say that the guy with the hoodie sitting in Beirut, Lebanon, trying to blow up a dam in India or something. That does happen. That's 100% true. But it's also the person that bought a uniform, a UPS uniform on eBay, which I checked this morning to make sure it's still viable. You can get a UPS uniform and you can waltz in and do all sorts of activities like taking pictures of people's passwords, which they stick on Post-it notes on their monitors. So with that being said, the military does something different. The civilian sector, you stop everybody and that's it. In the military, I would work with the intelligence group, and we would allow bad guys in to be able to see what's called their TTPs, their tactics and procedures and such, to be able to see what their capabilities are. You don't do that in the civilian sector. You just block them out.
How dangerous is that though? Once you let them in, aren't they in?
Yes and no. You've always got what I would call a kill switch, and you can always cut them off at the point of access. And you've always got your finger on the imaginary big red button. But you're able to learn an awful lot.
Okay, so I know you said I could ask you any question you like, but I'm feeling a little bit guilty. I've got some questions I want to ask you about Desert Storm and what you were actually doing, because, you know, we sort of got the impression over here that you were watching where all the bad guys were. You could zoom in on them and actually you could take them out if you had to.
Yes, that's a misnomer. One of the things that when I do public speaking on cybersecurity, I make it very, very clear that there are certain characteristics within cybersecurity that are very different than the real world, if you will. And I'm going to mention one first that I usually put at the end, but I might forget it, so I'll add it now. In the realm of cybersecurity, everybody spies on everybody. And I think that's a very, very important point. We would never in the past spy on any type of NATO type countries and things along these lines, or developing countries. But it's just a statement of fact that everybody spies on everybody else. And it's kind of a different kind of a flavor to the entire environment. That's number one. Number two, I like to get into a talk as part of my talks that the last paper I wrote for the military, which I was still in the reserves after being in the Army for 20 years. I stayed in the reserves an additional 16 years. And I was in Command and General Staff College. And the last paper I wrote, which was in the early 2000s, I wrote, "What is a combatant?" And one of the things that I made very, very clear is that you could have a person who is like a 70-year-old guy in a bathrobe in Brooklyn, and he's been contracted by the US government to take out a dam in Iran, which would then flood a military post down in the valley. So the question was, is this person considered a combatant? And if Iranian intelligence in this fictitious story were to determine that this guy was going to do this and then put a sniper in an opposing apartment building in Brooklyn and took him out, was that legitimate? And my argument was it was 100% legitimate, because that person, I don't care who he is, was trying to kill some of the enemy. So one of the things about cyber is it's not boots on the ground. You're actually able to do things remote. That's number one. Another difference is that with cybersecurity, you don't get any kind of a warning. Anybody, you know, I like to make this up and say you might see a whole bunch of people running across a field, and you can identify them by size and ethnic origin and what they're wearing and all of this. And you can see them climb a fence, and you can see them coming towards you, and you can call the police and say, this is what I observed. In cyber, you just get a knock, not even a knock at the door. They're standing next to you, so to speak, and you don't know who they are. You don't know who they are because you've got no way to be able to identify where they're coming from, et cetera. And I'll just cover a little bit about that right now. Nobody who's a perpetrator comes in from their original country. That was done in the early days. Now, we discovered 20 years ago, we would see the Chinese coming in through Argentina and Portugal through proxy servers. And one of the differences within cyber is that you have to be able to learn what is called a signature. And this means the way I'm just going to use the word, the way they dance and the way they behave and what they're doing. And you can say, aha, this is probably a Chinese, as a for instance. But then going a little bit deeper, you have to be able to determine, is that a Chinese military, or is this just a patriot, a person who's very proud of being a smart Chinese person to be able to promote China and their intellect and their abilities. I know I just said a whole lot there. The whole point I'm trying to make, though, is that you don't know who you're dealing with. It could be a guy next door, or it could be a person in Antarctica, or it could be an enemy sitting in a foreign country.
Okay, you've got me really thinking now. So what happens? I mean, our National Health Service gets hacked from time to time. How does that stop? Data goes missing. But there could be much worse things, couldn't there? There could be our friend in Moscow doing all sorts of things.
Yes.
You know.
If I can, only because you said about data, I'm laughing because if you know anything about the dark web, which is a whole different topic, it's a very complicated topic, but it's basically you can't get to it without knowing what you're doing, and you got to be able to come in with credentials like the old gangsters knocking on the door saying Joe sent me. That's the only way into those type of groups. But one of the things that's interesting is that there's so much data that is now being sold on the dark web that it's going for too cheap, and they're looking for other sort of ways of making money, which is why you're seeing ransomware just absolutely exploding. And one of the things, what I usually speak only to like boards and C staff, and there are some reasons why. But one of the things that I like to say is that when I've had a fellow who was the CIO of a Pennsylvania quarry, $60 million quarry, and they felt that their data was irrelevant. And the guy said to me, he says, we have old gear, it's not patched properly, but we don't care. We're not worried. The criminals don't want our data. And I said, you're absolutely right. They want three things. Number one, they want you or one of your people to click on something they shouldn't. And now you've got a ransomware event. Number two, what they want to be able to do is use your site as a place by which they can mint Bitcoin, use your electricity, your cooling systems, et cetera, and just put that in the background. And they go off and do this at thousands of sites, and they're using your resources. But the third and the worst one is they want to be able to use your site as a platform to launch to the next site. And so therefore your site is not on any kind of a blacklist, you're whitelisted. So therefore your address, if you will, is perfectly legitimate so that you can attack someone else, which they may have discovered is one of your competitors or one of your customers and such. And if they have a better cybersecurity organization and they call you and say, why are you attacking us? Now you got a branding issue.
Okay, let's we better take this, we better make this a bit more simple, okay, for the likes of me, not for the other intelligent people on the program. So you're saying everybody can get hacked like that and they'll click on it, everyone's at risk. But let me ask you an even simpler question. I got this asked at a networking group that I chair last week. Is it dangerous to have Siri switched on all the time? And is it dangerous to have Alexa switched on all the time? I'm sorry to bring it back to basics. I want to bring it down and then.
Oh, no, I understand. And to answer your question, yes, it is dangerous to have that on. Most of us on this call, and you can ask friends at a party, et cetera, have mentioned something to someone in the room, and then the next thing you know, you're getting my wife happened to mention Aldous Huxley this morning, and we were just surprised that it just happened to have a Google turned on, and that we got an invitation to buy an Aldous Huxley book. And so we quickly turned that back off. So yes, that it's amazing. It's not necessarily for spying, while it can be, but you are the product these days. So any sort of way of correlating data into information, knowledge, wisdom, and truth to be able to target you, yes, absolutely, turn that stuff off. I usually only turn it on when I'm using the barbecue for saying, cook 5 minutes, please, give me a timer.
I actually, after our rehearsal 2 weeks ago, I actually unplugged my 2 Alexas and I've put them in a box. I don't want that. I would say these are really smart, intelligent people I was with last Wednesday night, and they said they couldn't believe it. And I think they couldn't believe it. And I sort of knew artificial intelligence was doing that, but not to that degree. Yes. Amazing. And I'm sure there'll be some questions in the chat box about that in a minute. There'll be a few people missing because they'll be turning their Alexas off now, in case
one would hope
something happens. So let's go back to what's going on in Europe at the moment, Ukraine and Russia. Presumably Putin could turn the electric off, could he, if he wanted to, without cutting the gas pipeline? He could turn all our electric off.
Yeah, here's the other one of the other characteristics about cybersecurity is that when you use one of your cybersecurity bullets, it's gone. You can't reuse it. And I'm making that very, very simple. A lot of people on this call probably heard of Stuxnet, which is something where some countries, presumably the United States and Israel, formed a group to be able to attack a plutonium enrichment facility in Iran. And they had to use these things called 0-day. I know I'm getting a little too much detail, but use these bullets, if you will, that can only be used once, because once you use them, you can take countermeasures to be able to turn them off. So Putin is not going to use any sort of cybersecurity bullets that he's got until he really, really needs them.
Okay, so things like turning the pipeline off and things like that is...
It's how you get in to turn it off that requires the tricks.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm not sure we're going to go back to the heavy stuff. I'll leave my colleagues to ask you that, but we'll get you back on that. Now, tell me, in the army, it must have been pretty scary. What was the scariest moment of your life?
The scariest moment of my life was during Desert Storm, and I was with a group, this Special Forces group, and we had Linux or Unix machines back then, and I was debugging a problem at the same time that we had an inbound Scud attack. And I had to stop what I was doing, put on my gas mask, and I discovered my gas mask was not working properly. I had the wrong filters in it. And so therefore I had to take my gas mask off and just set it down and keep working. And I thought that was going to be the end of my life, but I was going to do my job until the last minute. And so turns out the missile did not reach us. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, I know you don't want to tell us too many things about that sort of thing because Alexa's listening. We talk about cultures on this program quite a lot, Curt, and we talk about different cultures. You and I discussed the difference between American cultures and European cultures, but you told me that you were working for one of these banks and you bought a Spanish bank, and that was a total shock to your colleagues.
Yes. At the time, I was with Morgan Stanley, and Morgan Stanley had purchased a bank in Spain. And we got a good team of gregarious, nice guys, and we flew into Spain to be able to start asking questions about the recent procurement. And regardless of how nice people were, we did not do a good job of examining what the culture looks like. And all of the people just clammed up. They wouldn't tell us anything. And we later learned, once we earned their trust, that we had totally blown it. And that with the Spanish culture, you want to be able to come in and spend the first 2 meetings just over a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or dinner. to be able to get to know each other before you dive into business. But of course, being New York and being the financial sector, you just go right to brass tacks. Bad plan.
And how did the bank cope with that, or how did they get themselves out of that?
By saying mea culpa an awful lot, and being much more respective in the future.
And what are you doing now? So you're in the private sector, which must be a bit of a shock to you, not working for a big bad bank or a very structured army.
Yes.
And you're becoming a professional speaker. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, what I'm doing right now, 2 years, it's now 3 years, I resigned from Bank of America and struck out on my own doing private consulting. Immediately was picked up by a company. I can't give you the name. It is a company in California, which is a government contractor, and they have been breached, and they did not have a cybersecurity program. So I spent the last 2 years until March working remote, building a program for this company, $500 million company, to be able to put that program in place. And simultaneously, I've been working on doing public speaking with the National Speakers Association. And as I like to joke, there's two different NSAs. The one speaks, the other listens. So, and I recently moved from the New York area to Philadelphia back in March. So since that time, I've been working on doing some limited consulting, but I'm much more focused on trying to get everything painted and get the furniture rearranged.
I think us Brits are amazed how much you Americans move across the country, miles away, where you have to get on a plane to go anywhere. It's out of our comprehension, really.
Yes.
But we've got two or three questions on the chat box I'm going to ask you, Curt, and then we're going to, I'll close the recording, and if you'll stay on, that would be fantastic.
Certainly.
From Nigel, who works at the University of Essex, say female students have in the past asked if their web cameras could be hacked.
Yes. Yes. The reason I laughed is that I'm going to take a step back and tell you, and you can go find out and see that this is not an exaggeration. At one point in time, many, many years ago, pre-internet, the CIA was able to get telephones, to be able to turn on, and they could listen to individuals speaking in the room. It's the same sort of thing. Once you're able to breach an operating system, you can do anything you want with any of the devices. And we'll just leave it at that. It's anybody who has seen the movie Ocean's 11, it's a movie that where some people breach a vault in a casino. And basically they play back on the security systems tapes that say everything's fine, we're not doing anything wrong. It's the same sort of thing. You can tell the computer that everything's fine and your camera is off and a little light is not on. So yes, it can be done.
How worried
Does it happen every day? No, but can it be done? Yes.
You hear a lot, particularly about women who are being stalked these days, and that would be quite worrying, wouldn't it, actually?
Yes.
For anyone being stalked. Is that something people should worry about when they're dating on Tinder and some of these apps? I mean, there's some obvious risks, but we can't get totally paranoid about life.
Yes, you can, and you should be. And in fact, what I do is I always, when I'm using, like right now I'm using a 35mm camera, but when I'm using my laptop, one of these sits over the camera, because I just don't trust it. I'm just going to be safe. And it doesn't matter whom I'm talking to.
Well, Nigel Kirby, you better not be telling your students too much about that, or you won't have any students, but we'll bring you in later. Here's one from Carl Walsh in California. With the US power grid being a mishmash of private, public-owned mini grids with no one in control, is there any motion towards forming national security, I guess, power function?
Yeah, this one's a little complicated. They're called SCADA systems that connect all the grid together and whatnot. And quite frankly, to be blunt, and everybody knows this, it's not up to where it should be. but they're working on it. And the reason I say this is a complicated topic, there's a group called the ISEC, and the ISEC stands for an intelligence group run by the government, and it forms in different sectors. I've been part of the national defense and a part of the financial sector ISECs, and you trade information. Well, the power system has an ISEC as well, and they're forming a coalition to be able to get things tighter and tighter. But a breach on one is a breach onto all. So it's, in my humble opinion, and I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, I think it still has a long way to go.
Well,
there are still some, I beg your pardon?
I was saying we are on record, so be careful what you're saying. Alexa and Siri are watching you everywhere.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
A couple of last questions. Two from John Lisby. I want to ask you, could we wipe out Putin's systems totally? That's the first one.
This is my opinion, correct? Yeah, I believe we could. I really believe we could. I think one of the things that we've seen since Russia invaded Ukraine was the fact that the strength of the Russian army is very wanting. And I've heard it described as a third world because of the corruption, primarily because of the corruption. I think that's probably the same sort of issues, and there's probably lots of holes. I'm going to be very careful. I wouldn't doubt we have actually bought some holes. I mean, think about that. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to say that it's easier to be able to buy your way in if you're an organization's, I don't care which government, it's easier to buy your way in than it is to fight your way in. So.
Okay, Curt, we're nearly out of time now on the recording. One last tip for all of us on here who might be a bit worried about what you've said, but what would be the low-hanging fruit, the simplest thing to do to protect ourselves?
I'm glad you asked that question. The lowest fruit, and the thing I tell everyone is just go out and get yourself what's called a password manager, or it's also known as a vault. And the one, I'm not recommending it. I use it. It's called LastPass. There are about 15 to 20 of them out there. Zoho has one, and you can go find one that you like, but they cost you $50 a year. They obfuscate your passwords so that you could never remember them. It's all hash signs and exclamation points, and it just squirts it in for you, and it works on behalf of you as a human. And while everyone always says to me, well, what if they get breached? Yeah, that can happen. That can absolutely happen. But they've got huge staffs of cybersecurity people to prevent that sort of thing. And the other thing I like to say is, you do banking online and you trust your bank. Why don't you trust using some sort of security software that manages your passwords?
Okay, actually,
that's number one.
Well, I'm going to ask you another question, but I don't know if you finished, but I mean, I do my banking on this phone. It recognizes my face and I'm in. Is that safe?
Facial recognition is good for identifying humans. It's not one of the top methods for what's called multi-factor authentication. You can trick it with photos and 3D printing, and we'll leave it at that. But it's better. My stars, it's better than not using multi-factor. The more the merrier. I make my wife crazy.
Okay, well, Curt Vincent, thank you so much for joining Monday Night Live. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's early in the morning, or it's lunchtime in Philadelphia. And can I ask members of Monday Night Live to give Curt the usual vote of thanks on behalf of ourselves. Thanks, Curt, and thanks for joining us. If you're watching this on YouTube and listening to this on the Negotiators podcast, some real food for thought from Curt there. The things that I thought I needn't worry about, I think I need to start thinking about, and maybe thinking about LastPass. Thanks, Curt. We hope you will join us again in a little while's time when we'll have some more questions for you. Thanks very much indeed.